Okay, good day to you all. My name is Zhenkun Lu. I'm the CEO of Friends of Multilateralism Group. Because we have a very important process today on the EU, what we call trade policy preview. I'll be very short, because we have quite some good speakers ahead. So the only thing I want to say to you is that welcome to join us. But for those who are not yet being offered the floor to speak, I kindly ask you to mute yourself so we have a smooth process. And I also want to thank Clem, who has been leading FMG on this trade policy preview initiative. We focus on a few selected members every year, 3 to 4, as we discussed. And then there has been quite instrumental in looking at the members' trade policy and link it to the WTO and its reform. So I will just stop here and immediately give floor to Clem. Clem, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lou, and welcome all to this trade policy preview of the European Union. We do these exercises periodically. Earlier in the year, we did Japan, and we've done China in the past, we've done the US, and we do them in support of the trade policy reviews of the WTO. It's an effort to improve transparency of the system. We do not have access to the WTO documentation on this, and I think that's probably a good thing. It gives our speakers, it gives us all a separate look at these policies with a view to expressing expressing views about the policies of the country, of the member under review. We have today with us I think a very strong panel, one of the strongest we've ever had. We're going to be led off by Simon, who will use his global trade alert to outline the policies of the EU. We'll then follow with Herve Jouanjean, who is a former very senior EU Commission member and is now with King & Spalding, and also Alan Winters, professor at Sussex, with a very varied career in economic policy. I'm going to hand the floor almost immediately to Simon. What we'll do is Simon will lead us off and will introduce the policy direction of the EU, at which point we'll break to give the floor to Herve and Alan, and then Simon will continue with the actual policy measures of the EU. So Simon, if you could lead us off.
Thank you, Clem. My task in this first short presentation is to take you through the recent legislative developments in the EU. I have read slides. I hope you can see them. If you cannot, let me know.
I can't see them.
You can't see them. Okay, that's something we have to fix. Let me try that.
Matthew, can you come in?
There you go. Can you see them now?
Yeah, I've got them.
Excellent. So the first section, I will discuss the key EU-wide legislative developments. Now, the reason for doing this is because we have under the van der Leyen Commission a slightly different setup than in the past. Traditionally, since the Commission has the power of initiative, anyone wanting to study the EU's trade policy would normally start with the latest communication by the Commission about its trade policies. And indeed, there was one in February 2021, which tried to combine a number of different objectives: openness, sustainability, and assertiveness in response to what they regard as a world which is going in a more hostile direction. And so we have almost a multi-objective EU trade policy. Now, in discussing this, I think it's useful to see how this is translated into legislative initiatives, some of which are in the works and some of which have been brought to conclusion. So I would like to break them down into 4 groups. The separation between the first 2 groups is less clear than the third and the fourth group, but let me take you through them in turn. Remember, the last TPR happened just at the beginning of the pandemic, and so during this current review, many of the pandemic measures will have been covered, I hope, by the Secretariat. One of the responses by the Commission, which is similar to other WTO members, was to introduce a lot of state aid or subsidies. The EU did this legally by introducing a so-called temporary framework in March of 2020, which it amended 7 times. In principle, that framework phased out in June of last year, but there are clauses which allow parts of it to phase out actually at the end of this year. And so the period under consideration here is 3.5 years of essentially relaxed state aid rules. And it should be noted that the European Commission's own website boasts of approving 3.2 trillion euros of state aid. So this is a significant amount of money. The second initiative, which is important, is the recovery funds, which the EU put together so as to stimulate the EU-wide economy from mid-2021 onwards. The goal here was to encourage digital growth in the digital economy, green growth, fairer growth. Around 723 billion euros of money was mobilized here, and it's clear in tracking some of that money to the member states which are said to implement these funds, that some of them have been made available in the form of loans and other forms of state aid as well. So there's an important state aid component, at least corporate subsidy component, to the next generation EU funds as well. A third initiative, which is somewhat related to the pandemic, but also gets a little bit closer to the EU's external foreign policy objectives, relates to the Net Zero Industry Act. Now, this is a proposal which relates to 8 key technologies necessary for greening the EU economy. And here there are 2 trade-related aspects which are worth noting. The first is that the EU has a target of sourcing 40% of those technologies from within the Union by the year 2030. And a second objective is that no foreign trading partner should provide more than 65% of any of these technologies by the end of this period. And the EU stresses repeatedly that they will implement this consistent with their international commitments, although they don't explicitly explain how this is to be done. So that's the third legislative initiative, which I think will be of interest. Turning then to the more newer measures which the EU has taken against foreign trading practices, the Foreign Subsidies Regulation has entered into force, and this expands the ability of the European Commission to investigate subsidies awarded by foreign governments to commercial entities abroad, okay, where those commercial entities ultimately end up exporting to the European Union. In addition, the EU has put in place notification procedures for M&A and procurement applications, which involve subsidization by foreign firms. And so this expands the range of subsidy enforcement. It would, of course, no list of like this would be complete without mention of the 11 sanctions packages, which have also been put on Russia. I counted the G7 measures as the 11th package. And so we can see here that as far as taking action against a particular WTO member, the EU has been very active as well. So this second tranche of initiatives are about protecting the EU against external threats or perceived external threats. The third set of measures are particularly interesting because they do not try and respond to either a pandemic or foreign government policy. Instead, the EU is taking measures to change the way in which supply chains are organized. And those supply chains that are being organized here are not just ones organized by EU firms, but also by foreign firms selling into the Union. The first of these initiatives that we have on this list here is the deforestation-free initiative, or at least the first that came into effect. And this initiative requires firms that are selling in the EU to identify, prevent, bring to an end, remedy actual or potential impacts of goods sourced from deforestation, the areas where there is deforestation. And so essentially, sellers of 7 different products have to demonstrate that where they have sourced from, including all the way along their supply chains, does not involve sourcing from deforestation areas. And so this is an initiative which is limited in scope in terms of sectoral coverage, Nevertheless, there are important trading partners in Asia and Latin America which are implicated by this, and they have been making their voices heard in Geneva and elsewhere. A broader initiative is the Directive on Due Diligence, which has been proposed. And here, this focuses on the obligations of supply chain operators with respect to human rights and environmental legislation or obligations. By my counting, there are 47 different international standards that the Commission wants companies that operate supply chains into the EU to comply with. The Commission estimates that these proposals will affect 13,000 companies, of which 4,000 are located outside the Union. Small and medium-sized enterprises are exempted. And so here we have an example of a measure which is in the works, which is likely to implicate how firms organize their supply chains. And if they fail to satisfy these requirements, they can lose access to the European Union market, which is, of course, the sting in the tail. No list of supply chain measures would be complete without mentioning CBAM, which, of course, is a regulation which is now being promulgated. And this is a separate regulation which we could take a whole session discussing, and many of you are aware of them. So I will not go on any further about this. Nevertheless, the key point made by Clem earlier, and I want to reiterate here, is that we have a commission which is actively trying to influence the operation of supply chains into the European Union. I should add, they're not the only WTO member to try and do this, but this is perhaps on a greater scale than I've seen in other jurisdictions. The last legislative initiatives that I'll mention are entirely in the digital domain. The Digital Services Act relates to large online platforms, so-called gatekeepers, and essentially elaborates the different provisions which deal with monopolization practices or abuse of the dominant position under competition law. A whole list of corporate practices are now illegal that were not previously illegal. The Digital Markets Act expands the list of entities covered from that in the Digital Services Act to include social networks, sharing platforms, app stores, travel and accommodation service platforms. So we have an expansion in the obligations of these companies as well. Both of these regulations are due to come in force in Q1 of 2024. Overall, then, you can see that the van der Leyen Commission has been exceptionally active in terms of regulating both digital trade and traditional trade, as well as in its very active COVID-19 response in ways that may have implications for trading partners. And I'll stop there, and I'd be very interested to hear what other people's reactions are. Thank you, Clem.
No, thank you, Simon. And could you keep the slide on the screen?
Yep.
Thanks. These measures, in part, I think, are parliamentary, and also they, as you say, are directed in some measure towards supply chains. Herve, is there going to be some resistance to this kind of package from the Commission? Will they go along with this trade policy that seems to be increasingly directed towards firms rather than towards countries? And will they cooperate, will they be fully in step with the parliamentary direction that is being given here? Herve, could I?
Yeah. Look, Clem, I mean, this is not only a parliamentary direction, it is first of all a Commission direction.
Oh, it is Commission direction.
Proposals are Commission proposals, which have gone through, for some of them, those which have been accepted, done through the Council of Ministers, the member states on the one side, and the Parliament on the other side. So I would say that this is clearly the transposition into legislation or draft legislation of the Commission political orientation as defined by Mrs. von der Leyen at the beginning of her mandate, or defined later when the events have so imposed on her. Now, what I want to say here, because in your mail, which sent to me, you said you wanted me to talk about the views of private sector and how the policies of partners affect the EU.
Herve,
what I
could
would
you
like
do,
to say here,
Herve,
I need, yes,
could you do that after Simon's second presentation?
okay, fine.
Can you stick to this major policy initiative part? And
But
I'm
what I
very
would
pleased to hear
like
you
to do here is to say that being where I am today, so in the private sector, advising firms both on the EU side and also in third countries, we have had lengthy discussions through association and others with the Commission. And the question which will be raised behind all that is this WTO consistent or not? I mean, is this something which will be harmful for partners? Is it something which is in line with the multilateral rules? And my answer to that will be, they are. I can say that in some of these measures, for some of these measures, the European industry has been active to obtain that the Commission makes proposals which are one way or the other more ambitious. And we are constantly faced with a kind of WTO wall, i.e. that when you talk to the Commission services or to the Commission legal service, we feel from the private sector side that they sometimes even lack flexibility with respect to the interpretation of WTO rules, and they stick to very orthodox, if not dogmatic, vision of the WTO. So I know that partners, and we know that partners are unhappy with part of this legislation. I'm not talking about the first group of legislation, COVID-19 Next Generation EU, because of course this has consequences on the partners, but these are internal measures, and I don't see that they have any active effect, at least through the various provisions of the WTO. But the foreign subsidies regulation or the sanctions packages on Russia, well, that's under Article 21 anyway. Foreign subsidies regulation clearly is an answer to the problems we have with China. And I don't think there is any difficulty in terms of consistency, to the extent and to the regret of the European industry that this legislation, as a matter of fact, does not cover goods. The directive on corporate sustainability, we'll have to see. It creates a lot of concern outside the EU. And I can see that many companies with which I am in touch abroad are really, let's say, in difficulty, in trouble, but have difficulties to understand how they will survive.
Are we in trouble here?
I think
Hello.
we lost him. I think we lost him.
I think we've lost Herve.
Yeah.
Herve, we seem to have lost you. Natalie, could you try to be in touch with him? And in the meantime, Ellen, could you take over, please?
Okay.
Alan, may I give you the floor?
Yes, sure. I can displace, not take over.
Yeah,
I guess I've got a sort of perhaps a slightly different.
I'm quoting a phrase. Yes, I'm sorry. Thank you.
It's a slightly different story. I mean, I think so. I've not been immersed in EU policy or trade policy since the events of a few years ago, for which I apologise on every level. But I think when we look at the EU, we see a sort of quite a strong commitment, stronger than I observe elsewhere, towards sort of sustainability as a leitmotif of policy. And also, I do think a very genuine attempt, to be multilateral or respect the sort of the multilateral system. Since the last, go back, say, to two trade policy reviews ago, I mean, the world really is very different, with sort of more assertiveness among major players. I don't need to comment on that, only a fracturing of the world trading system. And also, of course, with COVID, an expectation, I think, that governments should be more active, can be more active, and can be effective. And I think that's sort of part of what conditions what's going on. I think you commented at the start, Clem. It feels as if the Parliament is more active here. I mean, over time, Parliament has acquired a more active role in policy, and I think what the result of that is that sort of Parliament very much stressing sustainability issues has led to almost necessarily a bigger focus on firms, perhaps rather than just country level policy. And it is, in fact, pretty intrusive. It also, I think, is partly a response to, is this popular or is it sort of populism? In a sense, it is the governance process trying to show we are engaged with the things that you are concerned with. My reading of this list, I only focused actually on the last two sort of elements that Simon highlighted, is that there is I think I detect a much stronger willingness to address the issues which they believe, and perhaps sometimes expressed, consumers are interested in. Actually, I've been doing work in the UK, and when you ask consumers about trade policy, they only really want to talk about the sort of things that we never talk about, about sort of the environment and pesticides and so on. And I think there's sort of been a willingness to tangle with firms, a willingness to tangle with third countries in order to sort of try and achieve these really rather high-level objectives. And I think many of us would say important objectives that consumers have sort of thrown onto the table. So I think, with digital markets, digital services, we do see in Europe, to a much greater extent than elsewhere, serious and I think perfectly genuine concerns about privacy and abuses. It does spill over to other countries. Many of the players, not most of the players, actually are headquartered in other countries, and that's clearly a problem within the WTO system, in the sense that there becomes a sort of de facto discrimination issue, and let's not get into intentions in this, but it turns out like that. But essentially, I think the European legislative program is saying, here are the things, the way we think we should be conducting life, and frankly, we don't want to be sort of complicit or encouraging things that fall outside that. The second, Simon's third group, deforestation, corporate sustainability, the CBAM, again are essentially, I think, sort of responses to popular concern in Europe about sustainability issues. And this sort of perhaps gets back to sort of precautionary motives, in the sense we can't prove exactly how much damage we are doing to the environment, but it's not an unreasonable position to think we are doing quite a lot. I view the CBAM, about which I want to say more in the sort of second set of comments, as being primarily just a matter of tax equalization, of trying to say, look, we have both domestic and foreign suppliers to the European market. It actually makes sense that they both pay the same price for carbon. And similarly with sort of deforestation, the sustainability directive, a notion that what is being done in the name of supplying the European market does need to have limits around the amount of damage that it can do. Now, it very clearly poses a huge potential problem for the WTO because there clearly are trade, overspills into trade. It raises a question about the WTO's interaction with other agreements, Paris Agreement, for instance, and it essentially brings the trade system into conflict with another set of very sort of important objectives. And it does seem to me that where we are getting to in the conversation, we are fairly soon going to have to work out, as it were, which way we lean, or we need some very smart resolution. So I think this is a very interesting sort of set of legislative events, which I think stem from a perfectly genuine set of pressures. They are subject to all sorts of worries about discrimination, and one really wants to weed those out. But they have a very, they also have quite a large, substantive and genuine element to them. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Alan. Herve, is Herve back or not? Have we lost him? Natalie,
Yes,
do you know?
I'm back.
We interrupted you. Or do you wish to continue for a few minutes, and then I'll hand the floor back to
What
Simon.
I heard from Alan Winsters is very. I'm sorry because I was cut off. I don't know what happened with my system, but anyway, this happens. I think I can follow on what Alan Winters said, and as a matter of fact, what we have here fundamentally is implementation of the program of Mrs. von der Leyen.
Okay.
There is no question about it. The rest, I mean, COVID-19, Next Generation EU, Russia, this is something which corresponds to the events we have had to face in the European Union. So in a sense, I would say it has always been very clear, black on white. And as I said earlier, the construction of those initiatives, which is designed to face either needs, as rightly said by Alan Winters, in particular stemming from consumers, to bring consumer closer to the EU, but they are also aimed at, I would say, closing the gaps which may exist in legislation because of the developments of the services processes. I'm particularly referring to the Digital Services Act and the Digital Market Act. But again, for me, when looking at all these initiatives, if I look at it from a WTO angle, I would say that we may have views about it, but what I note is that the WTO concern was very high on the Commission agenda, but at the same time, and we'll come back to this later, it is clear that due to the kind of freeze of activity in the WTO, the absence of progress for new rules, we have certainly debates which have to be undertaken, and we have decisions, orientations which have to be decided at multilateral level and which are not, and which opens the door to a number of difficulties for the future. But I will stop here.
Herve, Alan, thank you very much. And it's been very helpful. It was in particular the idea that there was active supply chain management being attempted or going on, and perhaps the increased involvement of Parliament, which can be a very good thing, that drew my attention, and I'm very glad to have had your comments on that. Simon, thank you very much as well for this particular slide. I found it very, very useful. Do you want to go on, Simon?
Yes, if I can, Clem. And what I'd like to do is just to summarize the commercial policy development since the last TPR. As you know, Clem, I prepare these presentations for all the G20 members that are reviewed, and there is a much larger and longer PowerPoint deck available. If anyone wants to have it from me, they should email me or contact me in the chat. Now, I will summarize the main findings of the analysis that we conducted in April for this preparation of this session. And what I'm going to refer to is the information on unilateral trade policy reforms that's in the Global Trade Alert database. And as of the 25th of April of this year, we have over 8,000 policy interventions, which unilateral policy interventions by the EU, which were in force on that date. And as you can see, of the large proportion of them, at least more than 95% of them, were measures that tilt the commercial playing field in favor of local firms as opposed to foreign firms. There are some EU commercial policy reforms. We have 288 documented in our database. And I should add that our database is full of reports which are based almost entirely on official sources. Only 0.7% of the reports in our database actually come from non-official sources for the European Union. So this is pieced together, and the information that I will share with you on subsequent slides builds off these detailed reports of what the European Union and its member states have been up to. The first important finding is that the support for European sectors is quite heavily concentrated in 20 of them. As you might expect, some of them are in the agricultural sector, but essentially 20 sectors are responsible for about 62% of the measures that favor local firms over foreign firms. And there's a very heavy manufacturing component in this section here. You can see transport equipment, basic chemicals, and alike. These are all sectors which have received lots and lots of those 8,000 or so interventions, which I mentioned. So quite heavy sectoral composition. When it comes to the amount of trade covered, what we do is for policy interventions which covered products or traded products, we identify conservatively the HS codes responsible, and then we go into the UN Comtrade database, and with the most disaggregated data available, try and track out the share of EU imports from outside the Union, which are covered by different types of policy intervention types. And this slide here, slide number 9, summarizes, since the last TPR of the EU, what is the share of extra EU imports that are covered by different types of policy intervention. And so we can see in red the measures which favor local firms over foreign firms, and in green the liberalizing measures. So since the last TPR, it's our estimate that the EU has put in place policy interventions which cover 60% of its extra EU imports of goods. So these are policy interventions which were not there before the last TPR. Most of those policy interventions that cover this 60% are subsidies. So this is where I might depart a little bit from Herve. The crisis response turned out to be quite heavily concentrated in industries where the EU imports quite a lot of goods and services. And so we see here quite substantial shares of imports covered by subsidy measures. And of course, we can go into whether or not this was appropriate. We see very little tariff increases covering, we see tariff increases covering very few EU imports, extra EU imports. In contrast, trade reforms have occurred, and we estimate that since the last TPR, the trade reforms put in place by the EU cover about 20% of extra EU imports. So essentially, there's about 3 times as much extra EU imports covered by trade distortions than trade reforms. And so the balance of intervention is on one side. When it comes to the sectoral breakdown between agriculture and non-agricultural products, at least as far as harmful interventions are concerned, these are ones that favor local firms over foreign firms. We see that since the last TPR, the balance of intervention has been largely towards the agricultural sector. So we have almost 95% of all extra EU imports of agriculture face more difficult conditions of competition in the EU market than at the time of the last TPR. And this is much more than what we find in manufactured goods. So the interventions which have taken place, the support that's taken place in the goods sectors has very much favoured the agricultural sector, which is of course a traditional area of concern for EU trading partners. Now, as we have seen earlier, and I'll come back to it now, a lot of the intervention which is potentially holding back foreign market access is related to subsidies which are awarded. Now, according to the EU's own state aid scorecard, whether you look on the left or the right-hand side of this slide number 11, a lot of the intervention that has happened on the subsidy front has been COVID related. And so the argument is that these are extraordinary measures which will ultimately be phased out over time. Now, one of the analyses that we did was to take all of these subsidy interventions by the EU, which had phase-out dates, and ask in what month will they phase out between now and 2030. And you can see in this chart here on slide 12, the number of subsidy interventions which are in force and expected to be in force between now and the end of the decade. And you can see that although COVID is now over in 2023, in fact, the subsidies for schemes which are in force will remain in force pretty much through to 2028, although the number of them which are in force, it will decline over time. Of course, these subsidy regimes may be extended, but this does give you a sense of just how temporary the EU subsidy response to COVID-19 was. And it may also raise questions of trading partners asking why these subsidy schemes were not phased out faster. So that's what I'd like to say about one of the key intervention which the EU has done since its last DPR, which is introduced lots and lots of subsidies. And these have a temporary nature to them, but they may not be as temporary as some might think. Now, we also track which of the trading partners are most affected by EU measures, and with particular emphasis on developing countries. And what we can see in this particular chart is since the last TPR, we can estimate what is the exposure of different developing countries to measures put in place by the EU that favor EU firms over those developing country exporters. And we see an interesting pattern of results, and that is that the EU measures seem to impede more of the exports from the ACP, the African Union, and Latin American countries. In contrast, EU measures tend not to cover as much of the exports from LDCs, and interestingly from China. So although the EU is, like other developed countries, has taken a strong line against non-market practices from China, its policies that it's implemented have not blocked or at least reduced the competitiveness of exports into the EU from China as much, say, as some other developing country groups. And so there is heterogeneity in terms of the likely effects on the developing country members of the WTO, which might be worth exploring. Turning now to which countries have seen their market access eroded the most since the last TPR. There are about 50 of the EU's trading partners whose exports to the EU have been eroded by, or at least are at risk by an amount of $5 billion or more. Let me explain this further. Since the last TPR, there are 50 jurisdictions which are exporting $5 billion or more of exports that face worse conditions of competition in the European Union. And these 50 are listed here, and we can see that there are some countries which are particularly at risk: China, the United States, Russia, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. And there are other countries which are affected as well. So that this type of granular breakdown of which countries' exports are at risk is possible, and I think it shows the degree to which the rest of the world has had to adjust to the very extensive subsidization by the European Union since the last DPR. Now, moving from the Global Trade Alert documentation of measures to other measures, I'd now like to turn to SPS. Now, the Global Trade Alert does not track SPS measures. We do not try and duplicate the work of the EPING database run by the WTO Secretariat. But what we have done on this particular slide is going back to before the last TPR, and since then, we have estimated each year what is the share of agricultural imports into the European Union that face a new SPS regulation. And what you can see in this particular chart is that the share of extra EU imports facing new SPS regulations every single year is very high. And we can see that if you look at the dotted red line, which relates to the world, by the time we get to 2020, around 70% of extra EU imports into agricultural goods face some new SPS regulation. So we're not talking here about the accumulation of SPS regulations each year. We're talking about the fact that the EU chooses to implement new SPS regulations every year, and this covers large amounts of trade. And this must add to the costs faced by exporters to the European Union, and it must also increase the uncertainty faced by those agricultural exporters, and is possibly a source of concern to trading partners. When you look at SPS measures on the other, TBT measures on the other hand, you see a very different pattern. Before the pandemic, very few products each year faced new TBT regulations that the EU has reported to the EPING database. However, and perhaps suspiciously, the moment that the pandemic hits, the share of non-agricultural imports into the EU that face new TBT regulations shoots up. Now, it never shoots up as high as the SPS regulations I showed you on the last chart, but still there is a jump here, which has been experienced. For those of you who may remember our session on Japan, we saw a very similar jump in the case of Japanese TBT interventions. So there seems to be a pattern here which is worth investigating and understanding further. Lastly, again, shifting from goods now to investment measures, we have seen an important development we've seen over the past decade has been the introduction of FDI screening regimes by different member states. And these screening regimes, of course, add to the cost and certainty of cross-border transactions. And this too may be a source of concern for EU trading partners. So that's all I want to say about the changes in EU trade policy since the last TPR. I have a couple of slides on the EU's stake in the world trading system. And here there is a very clear finding that since the last TPR, the trade reforms in the rest of the world have created opportunities for about 10% of EU exporters by value. But in contrast, over half of the EU's exports have seen their foreign market access conditions deteriorate since the last TPR. And interestingly, the reason for that is because the rest of the world is awarding a lot more corporate subsidies as well. So we can see that the conditions for EU exporters have deteriorated as well. And there are 11 of the EU's trading partners that have taken steps that threaten $7 billion or more of its goods exports. So slide number 20 backs up the contention that 50% of EU exports face worse market conditions now than they did at the time of their last TPR. And this is largely on account of the fact that foreign governments have provided subsidies to import competing firms and to exporters as well, different types of state-provided export incentives. When it comes to the jurisdictions that have created or impaired the market access to most of the EU exporters, they're listed here. And you can see that there's quite a range of them, but 2 of the EU's trading partners stand out for sure. Let me conclude my presentation then by raising a number of questions that arise from the evidence presented here. I will just put 5 on the table. The first is that the EU and its member states make frequent resort to corporate subsidies. What steps are taken to limit greenwashing of subsidies or other misuses of subsidy policies? I note here that the Commission consistently argues that they do not provide subsidies to companies which were in corporate distress or financial distress before the pandemic, but that claim has never been independently verified. Secondly, what steps are being taken to build confidence of the EU's trading partners in its burgeoning regulations of private sector supply chains? And we've already had a bit of a conversation about whether or not this is a concern for the EU's trading partners. Third, must it be the case that high shares of the extra EU imports of agricultural goods be subject to annual changes in SPS regulations, or could a more stable regime be put in place? Fourth, what steps is the EU taking to make its regulation of the digital economy interoperable with those of its trading partners? I note in passing that this was indeed a priority of the Japanese G7 presidency. Lastly, we see that more and more exports out of the EU and within the single market compete against subsidized rivals. How is this informing the Commission's positions on potential subsidy reforms at the WTO? Let me conclude there, Clem, and hand it back to you. Thank you.
Simon, thank you. Thank you very much, Simon. Your questions are very pertinent, particularly the supply chains one, which we've already spoken about, but also the final one on subsidies. And there, I find it encouraging that FMG actually has now a program where we're going to look more closely at subsidies, and John Weeks is leading that. Herve, I'm going to hand the floor to you, if I may, for your comments on what you've just heard from Simon. Herve, it's yours.
Yeah, thank you, Clem. I must say it was an extremely interesting presentation. And I'm amazed by some of the elements, so maybe I will answer with, by asking myself questions. First, I must say I was shocked to read or to hear that the ACPs were faced with the highest adverse measures. I mean, having in mind what the EU is doing, I think it would be extremely interesting to go further. I have no answer to that, but I think it is clearly something which has to be explored during the TPRM with the Commission, because then it would be totally contrary to the objectives which we have established through the ACP agreements. On TBT and SPS also some comments. On SPS, it will be a question. I understand there are yearly changes to the rules. Now, is this purely an administrative change, or is it a substantive change? Because we know the EU regulations have a limited validity, and the very fact that you publish legislation does not mean that the legislation has changed. Sorry, this guy. So I would be interested to know whether we can go further on that. On the TBT measures, I would like to refer to my experience with the industry. I found the evolution of the graph also extremely interesting, seen from the industry side. I mean, there is an enormous concern in the European Union because imports of goods from third countries are not subject to any control of conformity. This is a very, very highly sensitive issue these days. We see goods which are not in conformity, which go through the customs control in Antwerp, in Rotterdam, and elsewhere, and which are put on the market and nobody cares. And it is becoming a very serious concern. On the investment measures, again, here, I just ask myself the following. All our member states, or most of them, have had, historically speaking, investment policies, investment controls. The big change recently is the fact that there is a first step to harmonize the use or recourse to the public security dimension. So it's not the control over investment as such, it's to ensure that there is a coherence between the member states as to the way they examine and take decisions, which remain their own decision, to authorize or not investments in sensitive sectors. Well, these are the first reactions I have from Simon's presentation. I would like to come back to maybe one or two issues which are much, quote unquote, wider. First, I think it is key to keep in mind that all these movements which are taken by the EU as we see them are fundamentally made to answer the concerns of the EU industry. If I speak on behalf of the EU industry, or what I hear from the EU industry, I see that there is a very strong feeling of discomfort. We have a WTO which they say the EU is strongly committed. We, the industry, are strongly committed to the WTO. But today, there is clearly a lack of confidence in the system. And it's because there is this lack of confidence in the system that there is a strong tendency to ask the Commission, ask the member states to take measures to ensure that they widen the comfort zone of the European industry. If you look at the recent history in trade, with the rise of China, the fact that there are overcapacities everywhere, that there are state-owned enterprises which benefit from very high subsidies, the unilateral activities under the Trump administration, the IRA. I mean, the weaknesses which have been identified by the European industry during the COVID crisis, the fact that the classical trade defense instruments do not work properly, all this leads the industry and, to a certain extent, the Commission, serving the industry, to take measures to better, I would say, manage what is the various dimensions of the trade policy. So that's one thing I wanted to underline. In the paper which you sent to me, the message you sent to me, Clem, you raised the issue of the influence of the policies of the partners on the EU. And I would like to take a few examples and maybe build on that. Well, first, the unilateral actions which we have witnessed in the past, and we think in particular of steel or aluminium, have pushed the EU to act its own way, more or less unilaterally. The absence, and we come back to that, of subsidies, of discipline of subsidies, has led the EU industry to ask for their support. The absence of a well-functioning dispute settlement understanding has pushed the EU to define its own way and to resort eventually to the basic principles of international law. The recourse to national security principles has also led to a big debate inside the EU. And the recourse by advanced developing countries to trade instruments, including safeguards under conditions which are highly debatable, also leads the Commission and the EU to react. So what I want to say through that is that, seen from my angle, this lack or this progressive erosion of the disciplines of the WTO, or this progressive erosion or the lack of new disciplines, leads at multilateral level, and in particular in the EU, despite their commitment towards WTO rules, leads them to what I call forced unilateralism. I think it's an enormous danger, an extraordinary threat for the system, because we have been moving in the last years from a center of gravity where cooperation was a key word to something where power relationship has taken over. I do not mean that cooperation has disappeared, but we have this change of balance. And so, in a sense, I see the evolution of the trade policy of the EU as a consequence of this situation, as there is no more commitment by the members towards a strong WTO. And so the European industry is saying, well, what is there for me in the WTO? And rightly, there is a lot for the European industry in the WTO, starting for the stabilization of tariffs. Just one last thing I would like to say, coming back to what was our first discussion, this regulatory dimension, societal dimension, which we have discussed about it. These are big challenges for the multilateral framework. We have referred to the climate change, to deforestation, forced labor, corporate sustainability. And clearly here, the system is not fit for purpose. There is a total décalage between what is requested, demanded by the societies, and what the system can deliver. And then there is a big fight because the levels of power are different. And therefore, if I were a developing country, of course, I would claim that these measures are against the rules. But there is also another risk, which I want to mention here, which is a risk for the EU as such. Recently, I was in contact with a firm which exports agricultural products to the EU. And together with the climate change measures, some member states are taking measures to control the packaging. And then you see that there are new barriers which are being erected, not at EU level, but at national level, because there are diverging legislations with respect to the use of plastic and whatever. And so I think here as well, the Commission should be encouraged to ensure that these kind of measures are strongly controlled inside the EU to avoid the negative consequences for third countries. We do not know whether they have to follow the EU rule or the national rule. So these are a few elements I wanted to bring in the debate, comments on what was presented, and a few additional elements seen from my angle dealing with the industry.
Clem, you are muted, Clem.
Thank you. Herve, thank you very much indeed. And I was happy that you brought up the ACP point. It's precisely that kind of stuff that we hope comes out of these sessions to lead to questions to the EU during the actual trade policy review in the Council itself. I'm also I was struck by your comment on efforts to widen the comfort zone of industry, and that together with forced unilateralism. Should the EU not be playing a more aggressive role in defending multilateralism? I think that's a question that might come up in the trade policy review as well. Yeah. And with that, I want to give it to Alan, and then we'll go to questions. But Alan, you're...
Yep, okay. Thank you very much, Clem. And thank you, Simon. I mean, I think, we've looked to the Global Trade Alert to give us these numbers for the last, 15 years now. And I think for almost the entirety of that time, Simon, you've been telling us the real problem is subsidies and state aids, and this just reinforces it. It's just had a shot in the arm, and it is pretty alarming. It is something that I think we certainly need to we need to worry about a lot. Also, it's not terribly surprising to see the EU slipping backwards on agriculture. In a sense, I measure these relative to my expectations, and so I think, well, yeah, I sort of regret this, but it is sort of par for the course. I think the distributional dimensions you picked up, and in particular, I picked up, also, the LDCs do still get a substantially better deal than other developing countries. And to the extent that it is actually, the poorest group in the world, that is not necessarily to be sniffed at. But I am surprised to see the burden that's being thrown onto the ACPs. You also mentioned to me, Clem, could I say anything about the private sector? I'm afraid I have to say I have very little to say about the private sector. I do think it tends to vary by member, and I don't know that there is a general position. I mean, in my very limited experience with private sector engagement is they pretty much hate everything that impinges on them, except for the warm embrace of the Commission, exactly as Harvey said. They value that support, and I think it has been. I think it is very plain looking, now from the outside, that industry and the Commission are pretty close collaborators, players on a very large number of these things. The British part of the Conservative Party thought that the German car industry would be so outraged at losing the British market for their cars that they would get Brexit sorted out from the inside. The German car industry just went along, probably perfectly legitimately, I'm not complaining, but it just, in a sense, it said, no, EU unity is very important. I want to talk for the rest of my time really about two issues. One, because I think it's important and I think it's illustrative, and the second, just because it's how I have to live my life now. So the first of these issues is the CBAM. I think this is going to be a big issue. I think it's very likely in this trade policy review, but if not now, fairly soon. Having seen your more detailed slides, Simon, I think I got a bit of a quibble about how you've been coding up the emissions trading scheme. And to some extent, it's a little bit like Herve said with SBS. There weren't new free allowances really in 2019. The nature of them changed a bit. The big problem with free allowances actually was that until about 2014, they were overissued, and they amounted to pretty much a non-production related subsidy to the firms that got them. Since 2014, the free allowances have corresponded very closely to the emission usage which the affected firms have made. But I'm happy to talk sort of further about that online or offline. I think the policy issues about the CBAM, I guess, seems to me to illustrate a number of features about sort of the EU policymaking position and process. I mean, it is very limited at the moment. There are only 6 sectors involved. It might, they're reserving the right to enlarge. And if you look at for the countries that are affected or impinged upon by the CBAM, actually potentially having to sort of pay a charge on the border, the largest, the top 4 are Russia, China, Turkey, and the UK. And in a sense, Russia and China have got there's a set of frictions around them in EU border. already, and indeed with the UK. So it's not yet a really major issue so far as most trading partners are concerned, but it is in principle. And I think that's essentially what we are going to talk about. My interpretation, as I said previously, is actually to think of this as just a piece of tax efficiency. All our education on taxes suggested that people essentially providing equivalent goods or services should be paying the same taxes. And that's the principle of non-discrimination as we understand it. And so you might feel it was reasonable to say, look, we now discover we need to charge a fee for use for emissions, and it ought to be the same in the EU and the rest of the world. The EU documentation has talked about addressing carbon leakage, which is more a sort of industrial sort of policy. It has clear political economy imperative within the EU. It's something we certainly come across elsewhere in WTO practice. The idea that would impose this tax, I will call it a tax cost, it's an economistic more or less is, will impose this tax so that other people change their production methods. That I think falls pretty uneasily within the sort of world trading system as a rules-based, principle-based system. So, I mean, I think it is in a sense open to a simple interpretation that is, I suppose, moderately benign. What I'm very impressed with, relative, to the Anglo-Saxon world, but I guess relative to China as well, is the effort the EU, particularly the staff work done by the Commission, has gone to make the CBAM consistent with WTO principles. You can sort of fit it in very nearly as a border tax adjustment. You can probably fit it in under Article 20. Neither fits perfectly well, for a variety of reasons that we might sort of go into. But in principle, they are very, I think, closely aligned with either of those routes. I mean, in what ways does the EU seek to fit the CBAM into the WTO principles? The price of emissions is set equal for imports and for domestic use, roughly speaking. I mean, I'm starting to argue a bit about some of the little wrinkles, but basically the price is the same. It's levied on actual emissions in principle. So actually the emissions that the good involved are charged. It makes allowances for the cost of carbon emissions that firms have already incurred. All of those seem to me to be very serious attempts to make it non-discriminatory. Now, it doesn't fit. Those things don't work perfectly because they rely on approximations. We're almost certainly going to have to fall back for a lot of trade on default values. And that gives room to argue that these default values are set in some discriminatory way. But even there are sort of discussions about exactly how to make that fact-based and objective, even if you can't completely eliminate any worries. The other issue is the administrative burden. And that clearly is a bit like a non-tariff barrier. I worry a lot about that. One of the worries I have is it actually tends to limit the number of firms that can import into the EU. And one of the things we've learned in developing countries is that among the most pernicious of trade policies we see in developing countries is that set of policies which limits the set of firms that can export or import, because it confers on them great market power. And so that is a concern, I think. But they tried, I think it's a sort of genuine
Alan, you are muted. Alan, could you unmute yourself?
How did that happen? I
Yeah.
got bounced.
I have no
Sorry.
idea. I was muted as well. Could you begin to
Right.
wrap up, Alan, please?
Yes, indeed. Okay, so I mean, I think the developing countries correctly say, look, the Paris Agreement talks about common but differentiated responsibility and respective capacities, special and differential treatment. I think one can cope with that. The USA hates it. I think that's because they have mercantilist worries again, but they really want to control the narrative about how we go about solving emissions problems. Carbon tax is a no-no for them, and having any serious conversation of something that looks a little bit like a carbon tax is very difficult. Now, I think CBAMs are a complete nightmare, but I've come to the conclusion after 15 years of really saying, look, I don't think we should be doing this, that there is no alternative. We should have multilateral talks. We should solve it multilaterally. Yeah, I'm right for that. But when, and how? Subsidies are potentially even more discriminatory than border policies, and we should do regulation. But how on earth are you going to create an international system with regulation? Regulation is hugely discriminatory, potentially, and almost impossible to agree. And I would point out that prior to the single market, the European Union, or whatever it was called back then, proved to itself the near impossibility of agreeing regulations between different independent powers. So I hope that the TPR discussion and subsequently will be actually rather measured and rather sensible when it comes to this. Not that there aren't problems, but that in fact, it's very difficult to think of other alternatives. And I certainly interpret all the Commission's documents on the CBAM as basically saying between the lines, dear God, please don't make us enforce this. Please actually initiate this global, this multilateral conversation so that we don't have forced unilateralism. We actually have led multilateralism. I was going to say a little bit about Brexit. You want me to wrap up? I'll say just 30 seconds. The issue for the Brits, EU-UK relations is not really the new legislative functions. Britain has just got to decide whether it's in or out. Is it going to align its own CBAM with the EU CBAM? Is it going to fall into line with the deforestation directive or not? The big issue for UK-EU trade is the sudden shock of being treated like a third country. In the EU, for imports into the EU, it's quite clear it's just burdensome. For EU exports to the UK, it's all a muddle. We have all sorts of postponements, derogations, undefined processes, and the result has been, even despite the fact that the numbers are difficult, because the change in nature of the trade has changed the collection methods, it looks as if EU exports to the UK are down 10, 20%, almost across the board. And that is almost certainly a reflection of sort of muddle and confusion with what is eventually a smaller market than the domestic market. So I think that's the big issue as far as the Brits are concerned. Then I should stop.
Alan, thank you very much indeed. Without further ado, I'm going to go straight to questions that you might have. So please, if you wish to raise a question, raise your hand. Victor, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Clem, but I think Hido and Alan were before me.
Were they really?
Go ahead, Victor.
Hido and Alan, please. Yeah, they raised their hands before me. Thanks.
Hido, are you going to speak in Dutch?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so I'll go very quickly, but just I think also to give a little bit of a sense from inside the Brussels bureaucracy on the TPR. I mean, whenever I hear these kind of assessments, I always hope that people will start by mentioning that we're still the world's most open trading entity in terms of imports and exports worldwide. We're still at #1 despite China's rise over the last 20 years. So we must have an incredibly open market also in terms of our GDP, our trade to GDP ratio. What is true, of course, that applies to every country, is that when markets are open, you always swivel from market access questions to regulatory questions, and you get inside domestic policies. But what I would say is that regarding our SPS policies, we have independent agencies. They're usually not based in Brussels. This one is based in Italy, that decides on our SPS standards. So there is quite a strong scientific input there, if not to say that it's almost absolute. And they are based on the principle of non-discrimination. But what is true also is that Europe looks at risk through a different lens than some other trading partners. Now, on Simon's studies, I suspect that my colleagues in Brussels would have a lot of questions on the methodology, because it seems to me to be rather quantitative. And there's, of course, a big question when you just add up measures, to what extent that actually leads to greater restrictiveness in a market. What is certainly true is that we have less scope to subsidize than other trading entities or nations. The EU budget, for example, is still less than 1.2% of European GDP. And in that we cover our research budget, our CAP, all the different activities, including the payment of the Brussels bureaucracy. So there's really not, certainly not out of the EU fund, there's not a huge volume of subsidization in the offing. And it certainly isn't in the same scope as if you, for example, look at the IRA, where the estimates were that it would be 370 billion, I think. And now we are hearing that it's going to be in excess of 1 trillion. So those are very, very significant changes. The other point about Europe, of course, is that we do ex-ante subsidy control rather uniquely in the world. And I think that that does also at least give some rigor in terms of trying to make sense of what makes what is good policy and not. What I will say is interesting on CBAM, just to conclude, is CBAM has been carefully constructed with long lead times. So the first 18 months is all about paperwork, and the purpose of that is to allow foreign traders to acquaint themselves with the kind of information they have to submit in order to set the values that will apply upon their exports. But the key question, I think, from a trade policy point of view is, will this policy help actually to help decarbonize the world economy? And there, I think the question is really, the jury must be out for two reasons. The first is that if you only apply it to a subset of products, it's 6 in this case, your trading partners are going to export value-added products with the same inputs. So you get the same problem we had with VERs in the 80s, where the United States or the EU would limit imports of cars from Japan to, say, 100,000, and then the Japanese would just sell better and more expensive cars to us. In the same vein, if we are going to limit imports of steel, trading partners are going to start selling us the big windmills, and any product that includes steel as an input and is not subject to the adjustment mechanism. So I think that is really the key question. Is it going to work? And the second is that, how do you actually get other countries to adopt carbon mitigation policies? That's really the key question when we are looking at the whole question of trying to decarbonize the economy. And I think in Europe, we have a wonderful plan for us. But there's absolutely no guarantee it's a plan that actually works for other people. And I think that's really, in policy terms, the main challenge. So I just want to leave that with you there. But thank you very much for having me join.
Thank you very much, Ido. We're rapidly running out of time. So Alan and Victor, I'm going to leave it to the two of you, but a minute each, and then I'll go back to the speakers. Alan?
Thank you very much. Thank you to Clem, to you, and the three presenters for a great program. Two real questions. One is Simon's presentation depicts a license raj or a regulatory raj, and a lot of it is in nominal number of measures, and I wonder about the impact of these measures and whether the EU, when it puts a measure into effect, quantifies what it thinks the trade impact or the economic impact would be, or whether anybody else does for these measures. So that's one point. Second point, as we seem to have the wrong WTO with respect to catching these various measures. Whether it's the EU, the US, or China, it's not clear to me that we have the right set of rules, which is probably not for a TPR discussion. And the third is Hito mentioned that the EU is the most open market, but I guess there are two comparisons compared to its history and compared to others. And it may be so, but it's a moving target in the comparison. And I just wonder whether if you look at the United States with the same lens, maybe we did in the I just don't remember, in the US TPR discussion at the FMG, whether how does the EU compare using regulatory means to what may be throttling trade, or at least affecting it adversely? It'd be interesting to know. Thanks for the opportunity to ask those questions.
Thank you, Alan. Victor, quickly to you, and then I'm going back to the speakers.
Yeah, okay.
After introducing Nakatomi's question. Go ahead.
All right, thanks, Clem. Thanks to all, very interesting. I was also struck by Simon's image of the effect on ACP countries. And I noticed that the second most affected were Latin American countries. So the question that I raise is, are free trade agreements good for anything, especially now that you're going to have CBAM and et cetera? And I'm sure Mercosur negotiators will be looking at those slides very carefully. Is there any advantage in signing an FTA with the EU these days? If that is all correct. Secondly, just a piece of information today, all major Brazilian banks decided that they will only provide export credits to exports of bovine meat if the exports of meat can already prove that they comply with the deforestation regulation of the EU. So even before the EU imposes the deforestation, the Brazilian banks are already imposing them on the exporters, which goes to the observation by Herve, which I found was interesting, that this is what society wants, apparently including the banks. Thanks, Clem.
Thank you very much, Victor. Now, I'm going to go back to the speakers, but allow me first to ask a question raised by Nakatomi. How does the EU try to improve the dispute settlement system? And perhaps with that question, Herve, I can turn to you, then to Alan, and then finally to Simon. Herve? Are you muted?
I think, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I think this is a question more for Ido than for me. You have all the papers done by the EU, and I'm not so sure that the answer is on the EU side, but it's more the US side. But okay, I don't want to enter.
Your reflections might be useful.
Sorry?
But your reflections, but please go ahead, sum up, and then I'll hand it to Alan.
Okay, no, I think on the dispute settlement, we know where we come from. As a matter of fact, we are going back to the basics of the discussion under the Euro round. So I'm not so sure that it is very, very, very constructive, but I will stop here. I just wanted to take the point of Victor on the FTAs. I think you've put your finger on something which is important. Immediately triggered in my mind the following reaction. I think the difficulty with ACP countries is probably the level of development and their ability to meet standards, both SPS standards and technical standards. And so I would say that it's more a question of development rather than a question of years. Because if you look at the statistics of the development of trade following FTAs between developed countries, EU, Canada, EU, Korea, even EU, Chile, you will see that trade has developed tremendously and that those agreements have been highly beneficial. So my answer is it's a development problem. And I will stop here. Alan Wolf made the reference, we have not the right set of rules in the WTO. It brings me back to the point I made earlier. And I think it's extremely urgent that we move ahead if we want to face the challenges ahead of us. If not, I think and that's my feeling as somebody in the private sector, the WTO will become more and more irrelevant. And we from the private sector, we will look at the Commission in the EU and we will say to the Commission, forget about the debates on WTO and competition, WTO and environment, WTO and labor. Let's go back to the basic rules of international trade and let's take measures within that framework, as others do not want to understand that we would have better results inside the WTO. So again, I come back to my point. The reality today, even for the EU, strong supporter of the WTO, is that if we don't move inside the WTO, we will move outside the WTO, and then the trade policy and the rest will, of course, bear the consequences of that.
Alan?
Virtually nothing to say. I just think the EU does need to keep the multilateral conversation going, recognizing, well, having, I guess, modest expectations and recognizing that it does have to keep things moving in a sense to raise pressure, but also to try and solve problems. Guido is exactly right. The EU doesn't run the world. It cannot change everybody else's policy. However, it can start to get its own house in order, and it can ask, are we having a good or a bad effect on the rest of the world? I do think we can't load everything into this single report from the trade policy review mechanism.
Thank you, Alan. Simon, the EU I'm struck still by a remark of Herve. The EU is trying to widen the comfort zone of industry. Is that consistent with supporting the multilateral trading system? It's a very blunt and perhaps too wide a question, but perhaps a remark from there.
Let me come to that just after making two short remarks. The first is that it's true that the EU central budget is quite small, but it's a central feature of the many schemes that we have discussed today is the EU taking small amounts of money and borrowing huge multiples of this, and then allowing that to be lent on or subsidized to, or provided as subsidies to corporate entities. So I think it's very important to understand that the Commission has been multiplying up the amount of money concerned. And let's not forget, it was on the Commission website where they claimed that they have marshaled $3.2 trillion of state aid since COVID began. That's what they said they had authorized. That's not Simon's numbers. That's from a Commission website. And that's only possible with the type of multiplying up that goes on. And of course, those monies are dispersed by member states and also importantly by the European Investment Bank, which is probably the subsidizer par excellence in the European Union at the moment. The second comment is to say that if you look carefully at the slides that I've presented, most of the charts which have surprised you are ones about the amount of trade that's covered by different types of interventions, not the charts which refer to the number of counts. And it's these the amount of trade covered, which is a necessary condition for there being an effect, which is quite worrying. And all the methods we use to calculate those trade coverage numbers are completely standard. And so if you found those trade coverage numbers surprising, I do think there's something to worry about. Thirdly, and lastly, Clem, to your question, a European official has two ways of trying to help European industry. One, you can try and open up markets abroad, either through free trade agreements or enforcement at home or enforcement measures against a foreign country or even the WTO, or you can offer selective subsidies to firms which are complaining the most. And I think when I look at the balance of the record here, there's been much more of the latter than the former. And so I think we do have some firms in Europe which have done a great job supporting multilateralism, but I suspect there are companies which are both supporting multilateralism and taking the subsidies as well in order to advance their competitive position, not just against foreign firms, but against other European firms too. And that's a critical part of the political economy of subsidy reform, which makes it so hard to take forward. Thank you.
Simon, thank you very much. And thank you all. Thank you, the panelists. We've run out of time. Thank you very much for this discussion. I've very much enjoyed it, and I've appreciated very much your interventions and the questions that it gave rise to. Lou, I'm going to hand it back to you to close the meeting.
No, thanks, Clem. I don't have much to say, but I think I agree with you that this is a highly kind of informative session. I think just to conclude, the signal from the panelists and also the questions, interventions is very clear that in this kind of highly geopolitical world now, many are going low, but someone has to go high. I think the signal is that you should take the lead in supporting multilateralism, in going high, probably in doing many things that would push the WTO forward. So with that, I thank you all for this, and particularly to Clem and also the panel for everything. And we look forward to seeing you next time at FMG session. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, Herve.
Bye, Guido.